Welcome to NovaraLIVE. Coming up tonight, Labour faces devastating results as voters go to the polls for the local elections. The retrial of 6 Palestine Action activists has come to an end. Zack Polanski explains to ITV's Robert Peston whether he thinks Israel has a right to exist. And we have an exclusive interview with an anonymous Google Deepmind worker on the unionization effort within the company's UK department. I'm Helena, aka No Justice MTG, and tonight your regularly scheduled Ladies' Night programming has returned with the return of Dalia Gebrial. Absolutely thrilled to have you back with me on the show tonight.
Thank you. I'm a little under the weather. I almost didn't come into the studio today, but I've had a Lemsip and a caffeine pill, and I've put loads and loads of makeup on, and I am ready.
That's what we'd love to see. We'd love to see you braving through it to come down and give us your excellent wisdom tonight. If you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. You can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And of course, please do not forget to let us know what you think in the comments section down below.
I hear that Labour agents, as part of the choreography around tomorrow night, are telling any activists who go to the counts where there are cameras, don't go talking to those cameras, and please, please don't cry on camera.
I mean, given how bad things look for them, I wouldn't be surprised if that advice unfortunately goes unheeded. Speaking of which, it is now crunch time for Labour as voters go to the polls in what promises to be a bruising election night for Keir Starmer. Some projections showing Labour may lose as many as 75% of the seats they're defending in local authorities across England. They're also projected to come third in both the Welsh and Scottish parliamentary elections too, with some polls showing them potentially coming in fourth in both as well. Now, if we stick with the council elections to start with, the polls show a huge pincer movement from both the left and the right. That means Labour would lose, as I said, a whopping 70% of the 2,500 seats they're defending, mostly to the insurgent forces of Reform UK and the Green Party. Labour are defending so many seats this time round, as every council in their creaking stronghold of London is up for grabs. And the last time all of these seats were contested was during the Partygate scandal, when Tories polling was tanking, and at the time, Labour were the only opposition. The Tories are also facing a torrid few days as well, as they're also going to get a thrashing from Nigel Farage's party, who have firmly placed themselves as the right-wing opposition to Labour, despite Kemi Badenoch outperforming Farage in the approval ratings. In Scotland, things look just as dire for the established parties, but in this case, a split unionist vote and the standing down of Scottish Green candidates in most constituency races means the SNP look likely to be by far the largest party in Holyrood, if a little short of a majority. The unionist split on the list vote also means that it's very up in the air who will come out to oppose the SNP in Holyrood, although most projections have this likely to be Reform UK, replacing the Tories there just as they have done across England. To think, not 18 months ago, Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar was the most likely to be the First Minister due to the SNP's internal strife, only for Labour in Westminster to obliterate public confidence in both, above the border as well as below the border as well. Perhaps the most historic result from these elections will be Labour's century of electoral dominance in Wales coming to an end, again with 2 insurgent parties attacking from each side. Plaid Cymru on the left are the prime beneficiaries of the fallout from Westminster, but also from Welsh Labour's own unforced errors. This includes the debacle of former First Minister Vaughan Gething being ejected from his role after just 78 days. Reform UK is set to breeze past Labour too, preying on devastated post-industrial communities and former Tory voters alike to come a close second to Plaid. A new poll has been briefed to number 10, which may shine a light on why Labour's fortunes have turned so sour as well. A report from UCL Policy Lab, using research from the Clinton and Blair ally Stan Greenberg, has shown that Keir Starmer has driven away progressive voters in their droves, explaining why the Greens have seen the largest proportion of Labour defectors come their way over the last year. The report showed that a mammoth 75% of those surveyed had a negative opinion of the Prime Minister, and that the biggest reason why progressives had turned away from him was around his inability to be able to express to voters what any of his values are. Long-time viewers of this channel will view this as nothing new. We've been reporting on Starmer's empty politics for years now, but having it backed up by high-level polling data that's been shown directly to number 10 could be the impetus for Labour to pull the trigger on ousting him. It's clear to basically any observer now that he's a man with precious few actual beliefs other than his own perceived technocratic competency. The report noted that even on subjects where the Prime Minister was on the side of voters, he was losing out on their support because of an inability to articulate the moral axis on which he makes his decisions, with The Guardian reporting this. The polling found willingness to confront Trump brought an intensely positive dividend from voters. But the report suggested that so far, most progressive voters felt Starmer had failed to do so sufficiently, despite his criticism of the US president in recent months. The polling found it was a position popular with Labour voters and those who had left the party for other progressive parties, including the Greens and the Liberal Democrats, where it was backed by more than 2/3 of voters. Progressive voters in the report's focus groups said Britain and the government had failed to show values-based opposition to Trump in the way that other politicians in Canada and Spain had managed. This explains why the Greens have been able to cannibalise Labour's votes so easily. Not only are they offering policies radical enough to meet the moment of societal entropy we find ourselves in, they also have a figurehead who was able to articulate a coherent set of progressive values to voters. This is the death knell for the McSweeney strategy of popularism, one pinched from the centrists of the Democratic Party, which treats politics like a triangulation machine, where you try and win voters by picking policies based upon how they poll. But all it's done is create an incoherent, value-free mess of a policy prospectus and made Labour look insincere at best or desperate at worst. And because it has no moral philosophy underpinning it, the voters it's meant to woo can easily see through it. Part of the research also suggested that the winner of the next election will be the one who best unites the bloc vote on the right or the left of politics. This is something clearly noticed by leadership hopeful Andy Burnham, who enraged Labour insiders by booking himself to appear alongside high-profile Green figures at a future event hosted by Compass, a group that actively promotes cross-party coordination to create an alliance on the progressive left. As we reported last night, Labour have ramped up their rhetoric against the Greens this week, and members of the Labour right have accused Burnham of trying to undermine their efforts, including friend of the show Luke Akehurst MP. Before any Labour figures or organisations start mobilising the progressive majority with the Green Party, it needs to sort out the anti-Semitism in its ranks. Parties that tolerate racism need to be defeated, not allied with. One thing that is certain, until Labour offer progressives something to actually vote for, rather than against, the only people they'll be able to actually appeal to are those for whom status quo politics and adults in the room vibes will suffice for, which research from More in Common shows to be potentially the case today. Prospective Labour voters overwhelmingly have positive views about their local area and local council, suggesting that Labour's holdout voters are the ones who are already the beneficiaries of the current settlement. And given that outside of the Lib Dems, really, every other party's potential voters have a negative view of their area, shows that Labour isn't offering enough of the single thing they promised in 2024, which was just one word: change. And what's the thing, right, is that in the run-up to these elections, the discussion was about where are Labour going to lose? They're going to lose in inner cities. There's going to be insurgent Green voters amongst younger, more progressive-minded voters. In the Red Wall, the older constituencies, post-industrial areas of the country, they were going to lose a bunch of long-time Labour voters who basically voted that way because of Thatcher, but just by having more kind of conservative politics in the long run, having different material interests to working people. When it comes down to where they'll win, that's the real story to me. There's been this drive among the Labour Party ranks to try and win over like an old coalition that they feel should be theirs of these post-industrial communities. But as I've said, those material interests have changed. And once they've deliberately driven away progressive voters by leaning to the right, expelling them from the party, telling them that the door was open and they could leave, engaging in purges that's made them lose hundreds of thousands of members, the only people they really have left are the kind of liberally minded Remainer types who, as we've seen from this data, well exceed every other party's voter base in how much they feel comfortable and happy where they live. We are looking at a country where we're seeing social decay on a grand scale in so many areas of the country. And the fact that Labour aren't picking up those voters in those areas when they promise change is a damning indictment on the direction of this party, in my opinion. Dalia, there was an article today in The Guardian as well by one of my favourite columnists, Aditya Chakraborty, talking about how essentially Keir Starmer is in this position by presenting himself to the media and the press as being the adults in the room, as being grown-up, sensible politics, and having nothing underpinning that and didn't receive any scrutiny because of it. How do you think they could potentially change this kind of paradigm that they've created, or do you think it's all too little too late?
Yeah, I read that Chakraborty article as well, and I really loved the fact that he talked about the initial responses of the commentariat to Starmer's victory, and he specifically pointed out, I think it was Robert Peston who he said was saying, for the first time in so many in our lives, we feel like Britain is going to be a stable place to live.
It was Andrew Marr, I think.
It was Andrew Marr. Very sorry. Yeah. Peston's on my brain because of the next one of our stories later on in the show. And yeah, that's the danger, isn't it, of pitching your entire politics to a very small number of people, which is the lobby journalists, who fundamentally live in a different world to the rest of us, to the people that you actually need to vote for you. And I'm not surprised that Labour are crumbling in the way that they're crumbling, because when you basically alienate and atrophy like a significant part of your historical base, then your coalition, your voting coalition, collapse. I mean, local elections are never good. What we would in the US they'd call midterms, but here, are local elections. They're never good for the ruling party. Normally, it's people who are frustrated with the way things are that are more likely to go out and vote in local elections. But even taking into account that precedent, the polling suggests that this is going to be a historically unprecedented bloodbath for Labour. We're talking about the worst local election results for Labour in 50 years, which when you consider where Labour started, which is with a historic landslide, that really is quite considerable. And, as we'd expect from the polling, yes, we're seeing kind of in the urban areas that loss to the Green Party, more broadly in post-industrial areas and suburban areas, that loss to Reform. And look, I'm really excited to see mobilisation around the Green Party, but I'm not deluded. This is likely to be a very significant victory for Reform if the polling pans out the way we think it's going to pan out. I would caveat that with, the night before the Gordon-Denton election, the polling was not accurate on how that election was going to pan out. They didn't necessarily have it as a Reform victory, but the polling suggested that it was going to be, a few hundred votes between it. And Hannah ended up winning by like 4,000 votes. So I hope that there is something within the polling that means it overestimates Reform votes and underestimates Green votes. But it probably will be a very good night for Reform as well as the Green Party. And when it comes to kind of the seats that are projected to change from Labour to Reform, I think it's really interesting that there are a fair number of seats where it's not just that Labour are going to come second to Reform, it's actually Labour are going to come third to Reform after the Greens. So even in those Labour strongholds like Bradford, there are projections there that, yes, Reform might win, but the Greens will be a close second. So when you look at sort of the who's coming in second in a lot of these seats, that's also where we see a sign of a really strengthening and growing Green Party. And especially when you consider the fact that Zack Polanski has not been leader of the Green Party for that long. They don't have the kind of money that Reform has. That is quite a spectacular growth in quite a short space of time. When it comes to where next for Labour, I mean, I think it's basically quietly assumed that Starmerism is over. The briefing from the backbench, the briefings to the press. I think Starmer himself also knows that kind of his time is coming. The question is, when is the leadership challenge going to happen, right? So for Andy Burnham, he has to wait for the NEC to let him run as an MP. It's unlikely that the current NEC is going to let that happen. So he's probably going to have to wait until the September elections, where there might be a new NEC that might be more willing to let him stand. Obviously, someone like Clive Lewis has said he'll stand aside so that Andy Burnham can become an MP. I don't want to see Clive Lewis is one of the few decent Labour MPs. He's not the one that I would want to see swapped out. But there's that kind of timing dynamic. Angela Rayner has been touted. She's still got this HMRC investigation going on. So I think that has to end before she could run. I think had the Mandelson scandal not been such a problem, not been sort of the official reason why Starmer would have to stand down, as well as the disastrous local elections, we probably would have seen a leadership challenge from Wes Streeting quite soon after the local elections. But in a weird twist of fate, I think even Wes Streeting might want to bide a little bit of time before he challenges the leadership, because if we're going to say that one of the reasons Starmer is having to stand down is because of his poor judgment of selecting Mandelson, we can't then, it's going to be difficult then for someone who is a notoriously close friend of Mandelson to then mount a successful leadership challenge. So I think Starmerism will be over.
I mean, it's clear from the data that we saw from Stan Greenberg there that Starmerism is the central reason why it's failing, right? Is this attempt to, again, replace the Tories because they were incompetent, bad rulers with good, competent rulers, rather than offering a vision for the country, offering a prospectus on selling it on, again, it's moral virtues. It's interesting that goes even further than the policy. Like if they had policies that weren't even like as progressive as you or I or other progressive voters might want, if they could sell to the public and those progressive voters even like a soft left policy proposal, but it had a moral conviction behind it, maybe they could have got away with it. But
or
they
a
can't
cohesion. I think it's even like a cohesion, like a sense of there is a unifying like some kind of unifying ideological framework, because without that, it's very difficult to trust a politician, because you have a sense of like, okay, who do you answer to? Like, what principles do you answer to? Obviously, reforms are awful and, you know, full of holes and morally bankrupt, but they do have like a unifying logic, which is that name a problem that Britain is facing, closing the borders, strengthening the borders is what's going to fight that, or like kind of persecuting migrants, that's the solution. There's a cohesive ideological framework. If someone doesn't have that, if you feel like someone is just going to say whatever they think the person on the other side of the camera wants to hear, it's very difficult to build trust.
One thing is like when they changed their membership card for Labour Party to have the Union Jack on it, or they started waving Union Jacks at conference. So this party that's historically been about, you know, class struggle and waving the red flag, suddenly having this wave of patriotism. Like, voters aren't stupid. Voters know that this is artifice. Voters know they've not just had this kind of Damascene conversion in the space of the time in which the Reform UK have gotten ahead of them in the polls, right? Voters know that they're being taken for a ride. If they'd articulated a vision from 2020 until now, developed a policy prospectus, no matter how radical necessarily it was, and they were able to tell voters, this is what we're doing and why we believe it's good, they'd been in a different position. But they've had this specific narrow focus, really, on here's a swing voting demographic, right? Like what we look like from the biggest change from the demographics that voted for the Tories before but then voted Labour now that really gave them the advantage. It was people who had mortgages who then saw their rates rise into Liz Truss. That was the biggest block of voters that moved from Tories to Labour. And they're like, well, if we can just promise these people we'll keep their mortgage rates low, then we've got every election sewn up for the rest of time.
Which is a promise that, by the way, you can't keep, because the reason that the mortgage rates are high is like not just something, unfortunately, that the British government can manage. It's a global supply chain issue. And I think that also, the point that you make about the flag, I think is really interesting, because I remember being in a cafe a few months ago, and this like group of old white ladies who clearly like meet in this cafe regularly at this regular time came in, and like one of them pulled out her Labour membership card. She's like, I got my new Labour membership card and it had the Union Jack on it. She went, it's like the National Bloody Front. And like what that tells me is it's like the people who vote for Labour because they don't like that kind of rule Britannia, like flag shagging politics, are obviously going to hate it. But also the people who do like that flag shagging politics are going to be like, I know that you're just doing this because Nigel Farage is nipping at your ankles.
Literally.
So why wouldn't they're just going to vote for Nigel Farage. So really what you had to do is mobilise and activate, the people who are put off by that kind of politics, and the people who maybe are partial to that kind of politics, but they aren't primarily moved by it. And so you can pull them in through something more meaningful. Because as I often say, like, you can't eat the Union Jack for breakfast. Like, I actually think that there's quite a small proportion of people who are like, for me, the thing that wins my vote is, are you a flag shagger? For a lot of people, it's like, yeah, I kind of like that. Like, it makes me feel like you're sort of for ordinary people in this country. But ultimately, I only like that flag shagging because I see it as an avatar for like caring about people in this country.
Yeah,
you know?
100%. It's also worth pointing out too, in that research from Stan Greenberg from UCL, we pointed out before, only 2% of prospective reform voters said they would consider voting Labour. So it's a hide into nothing. Like, it really is a hide into nothing, and they've made a giant boat that is now sinking, and you only wait how long and see the rats leave said sinking ship. Earlier this week, the retrial of the Filton Six reached its conclusion. 6 Palestine Action activists, Lottie Head, Ellie Cameo, Fatima Rashwani, Zoe Rogers, Jordan Devlin, and Sam Corner were on trial for a second time after a jury earlier this year returned no verdict on a number of charges, while finding all of the group not guilty of aggravated burglary for their role in an action at Elbit Systems factory in Bristol in the summer of 2024. Additionally, Sam Corner was being retried on a charge of grievous bodily harm with intent. As their trial came to an end last Wednesday, all the defendants, with the exception of Corner, decided to dispense with their barristers and make their own closing arguments due to what one of them called court decisions. Another told the jury that what they were saying in their closing was, quote, "not everything I'd like to tell you." You can read that report on those closing speeches by Novara's Simon Childs on our website. The link is in the description box down below. Those powerful closing arguments were not, however, enough to convince the jury. Returning its verdict on Tuesday, the jury found Lottie Head, Fatima Rashwani, Ellie Cameo, and Sam Corner guilty of criminal damage. Additionally, they found Sam Corner guilty of grievous bodily harm, though not with intent, the jury having rejected the idea that Corner set out to injure police officer Katie Evans. All four were remanded back into custody until their sentencing, which will take place on the 12th of June. Head, Rashwani, and Cameo have already spent 18 months in prison, with a brief period of freedom between the two trials. Corner has spent 21 months in prison so far, but two of the defendants, Zoe Rogers and Jordan Devlin, were completely exonerated by the jury. Real Media spoke to Rogers and Devlin outside the court after they'd been set free, as well as Rogers' mother, Claire Hinchcliffe.
We can't even tell you in what ways it's not been a fair trial, but we can say that the jury didn't hear the whole truth.
My co-defendants should be out here with me today. I don't blame the jury for their decision, as the truth was withheld from them throughout this trial.
It is a travesty of justice that my co-defendants aren't with me, as the damage to Elbit weapons they're accused of was to save Palestinian lives.
It's been extraordinary throughout this trial that we've had a very detailed itemised list and photographs of all the tools that the activists took in to dismantle weapons, but nothing about the weapons.
Drones we found inside the factory included Thor VTOL quadcopter drones, which are used to drop grenades, advertised as battle-tested on Palestinians. We also found Magni-X surveillance drones, and Israel's surveillance drones work in tandem with AI to pick out targets, while the soldier far away spends an average of 7 seconds deciding if that person gets to live or die.
We haven't got anyone from Elbit Systems UK appearing in court to give evidence. Clearly they don't want us to know what it was that was destroyed. And that is very sinister. When it comes to sentencing, we need to know the value of what was damaged. So how can we know that if we don't know exactly what these weapons were?
The litmus test has been failed for democracy and rule of law in this country. Please show up for my co-defendant sentencing hearing on the 12th of June.
I'm now joined by Stephen Methven, who's done extensive reporting on the Palestine Action trials so far. This is obviously a mixed ruling. There are some wins, some losses here. There is a broader conversation to have about how we got here in the first place. What was your initial reaction to this result?
I mean, surprise, to be honest. Surprise. I feel like I wasn't really ready to hear that any of them would be found guilty of criminal damage, and four of them were. But I was pleased about the dropping of the intent part of the grievous bodily harm charge against Sam Corner. I wasn't in court for all of the closing arguments on the last day, but I was there for Zoe Rogers' one, which was the last one to be given, and she gave it herself, and it was very powerful. And maybe that the fact that she is now free and fully acquitted, along with Jordan Devlin, partly on the strength of their closing arguments. It's very hard to know because, of course, quite rightly, we can never know how the jury deliberated in the way that they did, and we can never ask. We should never ask. But it is striking that, if you look at the facts of the case, it's unclear. And I've looked at all the reporting on the case. And in fact, if anybody wants to, they can go and look at Real Media's court reporting throughout both trials, which has been excellent. It's very hard to find a distinction that makes sense of the difference in the findings in terms of criminal damage. On the Corner grievous bodily harm case, I mean, I think what was so important there was that in the closing arguments made by his barrister, and he was the only one, because he was facing such a serious charge, the only one who continued to use his barrister for the closing arguments. The other 5 defended themselves, and I'll get onto that in a second. I think that really was, the argument made by his barrister was, very compelling, because it was what it really focused on in order to establish the intent part of the claim, is that there was an intention to injure the police officer in question. And I think there was a very good summing up of the facts, which involved, Corner having been sprayed in the eyes with Pava spray, there having been security guards around who had been, in some cases, behaving threateningly. Ellie Cameo having, screaming out in pain because, she was tased twice, once accidentally, a second time accidentally, kind of creating a scene in which, as he said in his testimony, he was trying to defend her. And I think the barrister made the case for the defense barrister was that, in all of the chaos, there was no intentional knowledge that the person there was a police officer. What the jury must have made presumably something of that, because they dropped that aspect of the charge. On the it was very unusual when the 5 other defendants on the criminal damage charges, when they suddenly didn't have their barristers defending them, and suddenly decided that they were going to make their own closing arguments, speak directly to the jury as a jury of their peers, which of course the jury is. And there were some indications in some of the things that were said, and some that we might come on to in a moment. So Lottie Head, for example, in her closing, said that explaining why she'd given up her barrister for the closing, said, "Sadly, despite how unbelievably kind and smart my barristers are, after some decisions made by the court, I no longer feel like they are permitted to represent me in a way that does us all justice. So I've had to represent myself." In her closing arguments, Zoe Rogers not only, admitted that she'd done what she'd done, but also called it the best thing I've ever done. And she thought because she said there was a good chance that innocent lives were saved. And she said she would never, ever be ashamed that she was on trial and that she spent 18 months in prison. So yes, that's a mysterious split in the verdicts over criminal damage, but those are the jury's verdicts. They're final. I'm very glad that Jordan Devlin and Zoe Rogers at least have been exonerated, and that whatever sentencing is going to happen on the 12th of June, Sam Corner will not be facing the intent charge, which is obviously something that makes holds the idea of it being premeditated or part of the planning or something like that.
Okay, fair enough. That's again, I was really mystified as well with the split verdict in terms of who was exonerated and who wasn't. So your guess is as good as mine. Now, obviously, there are some lifting of reporting restrictions now. That's meant that another aspect, a very shocking aspect of this case, has come to light. Rajiv Menon, KC, is a highly regarded barrister who has worked on renowned inquiries into the Grenfell Tower, Stephen Lawrence's murder, and undercover policing. He was also Charlotte Head's defence barrister in the 2 trials of the Filton 6, the first of which began in November last year. In that first trial, all 6 were acquitted of aggravated burglary, a charge that was then dropped against the remaining 18 Filton defendants. Rogers, Devlin, and Rajwani were also acquitted of violent disorder, with the jury further returning no verdict on all other charges. Weeks later, Head, Corner, and Cameo were all formally acquitted of violent disorder too. But it can now be revealed that Menon himself is facing contempt of court proceedings. But why? It's because he's alleged to have broken a court order by mentioning, in open court, that British juries have an absolute right to acquit defendants. Writing for Novara, journalist Tom Midlane says this: "Before the first 2 trials involving Head, Mr. Justice Johnson ruled that the actions of the Israeli military in Gaza did not constitute a lawful excuse for her and her co-defendants. Johnson also banned barristers from inviting the jury to apply the principle of jury equity, by which juries can choose to acquit based on their conscience. However, Menon is alleged to have made reference in his closing speech to Bushell's case, a 1670 decision associated with establishing the independence of juries, and an Old Bailey plaque highlighting the right of juries to give their verdict according to their convictions. The effect of Mr. Menon's speech was to invite the jury to disregard my directions that they should put the views of the Middle Eastern war in Gaza and emotion to one side, Johnson said. Lawyers for Menon have challenged the case and are awaiting a decision from the Court of Appeal. But this can only be reported now because some reporting restrictions in this case have been lifted since the delivery of the verdicts last week. It's fair to say the case has sent shockwaves through the legal profession. Esteemed human rights barrister Michael Mansfield KC told Declassified this. I've been at the bar for over 50 years. I'm extremely concerned about the issues that are at the centre of this initiative, which has never been done before as far as I'm aware, particularly the chilling effect upon the critical concept of a fiercely independent bar, fearless in its pursuit of justice and on behalf of those it represents. Stephen, this is quite a shocking development, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And it's shocking, and it's in some ways historic because I think it's the first time since 1670 that such a case, as far as we know, has ever been heard. And it really does go to this important principle of jury equity and the question of equity of juries rather in this country at all. So I'm not sure that I would call jury equity as in there's a lively sort of debate about whether it's a right that juries have or whether it's a power that juries have. Well, whatever it is, the fact is that there are two principles that mean that juries can make a decision and have always been able, since 1670, have always been able to make a decision which is their own to make. And the principles are that they cannot be directed by a judge to find anybody guilty. They can be directed to find somebody innocent if the judge, in various conditions, but they cannot be directed by a judge to find anybody guilty. And second, they cannot be asked, even by a judge, how they deliberated or came to the decision that they came to in any case. So if you put those two together, it leaves this space where you may call it a right, you may call it a power, where juries can make a decision. They can make whatever decision they want because no one can tell them what to do and no one can ask them what they did. That's essentially the principle of jury equity. And there's been this increasing fashion for judges, especially in these cases that involve civil disobedience, that involve direct action, which involve any kinds of cases where your reasons for breaking the law can involve an act of conscience that might appeal to the jury if you were to reveal why it was that you did the thing, what the greater crime was that you were attempting to prevent. There's been an increasing fashion in which judges really do not want juries to know that they can do that, do not want juries to be having in mind that their own conscience can play a part in determining the guilt or otherwise of the person who's been charged. And in this case, the allegation seems to be that the barrister in question breached potentially some orders put in place by the judge, which were directing everybody in the courtroom not to allow the jury to become aware, or not to deliberately try to make the jury aware of such matters as jury equity or their conscience. That's how it appears from the reporting. And that has now led to, inevitably, because barristers, defense lawyers, have a duty to their clients to do their utmost to defend them. And that puts you into an immediate sort of conflict between the judiciary and the barrister, because the barrister has one duty and the judiciary is trying to do something else, and that's inevitably going to come into conflict, as it seems to have done in this case. I mean, it is worth pointing out that Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who is currently presiding over a government which is attacking jury trials pretty ferociously, and it says it's doing it in the interest of speedy justice, and it's exploiting the suffering of rape and sexual assault victims in order to make that argument. Actually, all of the evidence shows that cutting jury trials is going to make no difference to the speed with which those trials are held, or with which justice is delivered in those cases. It seems very clear that actually what it is about not creating environments where this tension between what the judge is trying to do and the duty of the barrister can come into play, or in other words, not creating environments in which juries can exercise the power that they have to discharge on whatever grounds they want. It doesn't even have to be on conscience, to be honest. They have a power to discharge on whatever grounds they want. And that man who is leading the government, who is now conducting this assault on jury trials, which, by the way, are, for many of us, the only defense we have against being judged by an aloof, detached establishment figure, as judges so often are, unfortunately. They're the only connection you might have in the dock to your peers. This Prime Minister leading a government, attacking all of that. And the horrible hypocrisy and irony of it is that when he was building his career as a human rights lawyer, defense lawyer, he depended on this on more than one occasion, on the right of a jury to acquit on the grounds of their conscience. So I think that this case has sent, as you said, shockwaves through the legal community. I've spoken to lawyers, many of whom in very lawyerly way have said things like, the handling of this case has been deeply unsatisfactory. And they're not just talking about the barrister's case, but the overall thing, that there's something unsatisfactory about the way in which...
Is that lawyer speak for absolute bullshit?
I mean, look, I can't interpret it, but I would say, yeah, that's lawyer speak for fucked up. And it's... because it gets at so many different principles of justice here. One was that justice should be open. We should be able to see what's going on. Two, that the jury should be free to make its decision. And three, that defense barristers should be able to uphold their duty to defend to the best of their ability and, like as Mansfield said, fiercely and bravely their clients.
I mean, it does seem from that, obviously, the restrictions on process as well from this government. So we have a very, very authoritarian administration, and it's very worrying.
We have, they would not describe themselves as authoritarian, but I think they might be a kind of government where authoritarianism creeps in because they're a technocratic, results-driven government.
There's no
stats.
Yeah, there's no liberal values underpinning this, as mentioned earlier on.
Yeah. There's just political expediency.
100%, which is, again, that is, as far as we can see, like the mother of all of the roads to hell. Paved with technocratic intentions.
Yeah. And then none of them are good. They are just technocratic. They are just like, oh, let's get these numbers down. No question about whether the numbers should be high or not. They're just like, let's get them down.
Yeah, it's the utility of the policies they're pushing. Yeah. Indeed. So thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Yeah, thanks, Helena.
After a less than ideal week of media rounds for Zack Polanski, he made his last appearance before voters head for the polls on ITV's Peston, where he was asked about his opinions on Zionism as a British Jew.
Just on this issue of what it is to be a Jew in today's Britain, you describe yourself as a non-Zionist Jew. What do you mean when you say a non-Zionist in these circumstances?
Well, just first of all, to pick up on you saying it was grim, there was polling out today, which I know you saw as well, that said 40% of British people in this country don't think the country would necessarily be better or worse if Jews left the country. That's deeply depressing, and I think that should be sobering for anyone in public life to look at what do we do to make sure that Jewish people are welcome in this country. In terms of being an anti-Zionist or a non-Zionist, it's ultimately recognizing that I want to see equality for the Palestinian people, that there's been a genocide for the last couple of years, that our government have been arming and sharing intelligence. I want to see an end to that genocide, and I want to see equality of voices at the table in making sure that we're building peace.
I mean, some, again, in the Jewish community would say you shouldn't there is an international criminal court case going on, and they would say you shouldn't be judging whether it's a genocide or not as a political leader until the case, or in fact cases, are heard.
On the genocide point, it's not my opinion, it's genocide scholars. It's Francesca Albanese, the special UN rapporteur, and lots of eminent experts who have been very clear it's a genocide. I don't think you can wait until afterwards, after all the children and people have been killed and murdered and massacred, to then go, now it's time to do something about it. Anyone who has a phone can see every single day streamed images of some of the most brutal attacks ever.
I'm not really pushing back on, but I'm not really pushing back on what we've seen. I'm just simply saying, is it a responsible position for somebody who wants to be Prime Minister to prejudge what is a legal issue?
I think what would be incredibly irresponsible is what this Prime Minister is doing, which is seeing the death and destruction that's happening every single day and continue to arm a genocidal apartheid state. I think it's really important that we use the power and leverage that we have, that we don't wait until after the event. And by the way, even if it wasn't a genocide, even if it's tens of thousands of people who are being murdered and massacred who are innocent, surely that's enough to do something about it.
And Zack's 100% correct there, right? Like, there's a reason why politicians have been so reticent to describe it as a genocide, because as signatories to the Genocide Convention, it compels states to act. It compels states to act, to intervene, to prevent genocide, right? And as soon as political parties, as soon as governments acknowledge that there has been a genocide that's been committed, they have been found wanting in refusing to act to be able to prevent it. Coming back years later after some court somewhere has adjudicated it's definitely 100% is a genocide, despite all of the huge consensus of genocide scholars, of NGOs, of charities, of people who are actual experts on this stuff coming to that conclusion whilst it's happening, that doesn't save anybody's lives. That doesn't do anything. Imagine if there'd been no intervention in Bosnia at all, because people were like, well, let's wait until the ICJ's done its work on the genocide in Bosnia, then we'll come in later on. No, there were boots on the ground to try and prevent genocide at the time, and that was necessary. That was necessary, right? But again, like when it was happening in Eastern Europe, there is a political incentive to intervene. There is not a political incentive to intervene when it is a friend of the West, quote, quote, part of our Western family, as Oliver Dowden once put it on BBC's Laura Kuenssberg, in the Middle East, who's committing that genocide, because then suddenly you have to intervene with an ally, and nobody wants to be the one that pushes the button which says intervene in an ally committing genocide, because, again, they would have been found wanting in not intervening up until that point. Next in the interview, Peston pressured him on a question that I think I can speak for everyone at home when I say we're all sick of hearing.
But just to be clear, because this is something of enormous importance to the Jewish community, as somebody who's either a non or an anti-Zionist, I mean, do you believe that Israel has the right to exist in its current form? Yes or no?
I don't believe any country has a right to exist. People have a right to exist. The Israelis have a right to exist. The Palestinians have a right to exist. And I think it's our role as a third country to make sure that there's fairness and transparency and accountability about a peace process. I always think these semantics about whether a country has a right to exist actually just ends up in gatekeeping, which is partly how we ended up in this mess in the first place with the Balfour Declaration.
But the implication of that, of course, is that Britain doesn't have a right to exist, which also carries quite heavy connotations.
As you can imagine, this immediately provoked an outbreak of hysteria online, and many right-wing figures decided to give their 2 cents on Twitter. This was from former Israeli spokesperson Elon Levy. Israelis have a right to exist is a concession that should enrage the anti-Zionist movement, which does not believe that. It wants to murder, expel, or at best subjugate the Israelis. Journalist Nick Tyrone then said this. Hold on, so Palestine doesn't have a right to exist then? Is that what Polanski is saying here? And of course, on top of that, security analyst Jimmy Rushton said this. I would gently suggest that believing the United Kingdom has a, quote, right to exist should be a basic prerequisite for a man who presumably wants to become Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. So let's take all three of those claims in reverse order, right? So not believing that any country has a right to exist, including the one that you're currently a resident of, that has nothing to do with whether or not you want to be in charge of it. It also has nothing to do with whether you think it should exist or not. What people continually have been doing throughout this entire conversation when it comes to the UK, Palestine, Israel, whatever it is understanding the difference between the positive statement of no country has a right to exist, which is true. Countries and states are emergent entities created through agreements between people. They are social contracts. They are constructed through people coming together to create them. They don't have inherent inalienable rights of their own. The people within those states have them to be able to form them in the first place through self-determination, through broader utility, and those things are governed by international agreements. For example, like Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist, but it was formed in the breakup of the Soviet Union through predetermined boundaries and through international agreements, and then was solidified broadly within the international community, right? And Russia intervening and breaking that by invading is, again, violation of the UN Charter and the sanctity of the territory. It's nothing to do with its quote-unquote right to exist. Likewise, in the case of Palestine, as Nick Tyrone was pointing out there, when it comes to Palestine having a right to exist, no, it doesn't have a right to exist. But it should exist. That's a normative statement. It should exist because the Palestinians deserve to at least have citizenship, to not be continually, endlessly stateless, to be family after family of refugees, to return to the houses they were ethnically cleansed from during the Nakba, or during the Six-Day War, or during the Yom Kippur War, or whatever it might be. There are plenty of reasons why Palestine should be a state. That doesn't mean it has some kind of right to a state, because again, it's not a thing, it's not a person, it's not a thing that would create rights of its own simply by existing. There is the right of the Palestinians to form a state of their own, and that is it. As for Elon Levy's point, the idea that they want to purge Israelis, the anti-Zionist movement, that is flatly true. I saw some of the Board of Deputies on Politics Live earlier this week saying that from the river to the sea is the language of ethnic cleansing. That's just not the case. Even you go back as far as George Habash, from the founder of the PFLP, he was very clear from the start that the ideal goal of the anti-Zionist movement was the creation of a binational or secular, non-ethnically centered democracy across the whole of former mandatory Palestine, involving Jews and Palestinians and Arabs and Druze and Circassians all living together as part of a secular democracy. That doesn't involve ethnic cleansing. That doesn't involve what Elon Levy is saying that anti-Zionists want. That is just the one-state solution, and it always has been. As for the United Kingdom, it doesn't have a right to exist because at any time in the future, Scotland could secede, Wales could secede. It is written into the Belfast Agreement that at any point in which the people of the 6 counties want to become part of the Republic of Ireland, there will be a border poll and that will happen, and the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland will cease to be. It'll be the United Kingdom of Great Britain, or just be Britain, or could be England and Wales if Scotland leave, or indeed just England. There is no right of the United Kingdom to exist. It does exist. It exists right now, and the people within that nation have rights. But the future of what that looks like is entirely governed by convention. Dalia, what do you make of the clips that we saw there?
I mean, I have deja vu. Like, I can't believe that we are back here again. I mean, on the one hand, I'm like, okay, well, it makes sense that this is what they would use against Zack Polanski because it ultimately worked when they did it last time. But at the same time, I'm almost surprised that this is the path that they want to go down because, and by them, I mean sort of the press and the political establishment, because we're not in 2018 anymore. You know, we're living in a very different moment. There isn't this, I think, but before the genocide, there was this kind of broad impression that a lot of people had that Israel was this kind of liberal democracy, this law-abiding, rules-abiding, rose in the desert that was trying to survive in a barbaric neighborhood full of people who just wanted to kill them for no reason. And even your most uneducated person, or your person who's just sort of gleaning off, the surface of what has happened over the past 3 years, that impression has changed. There is now a broad understanding that Israel is not this rose in the desert. Israel is a country that can and will do absolutely heinous things, including things that are considered by the highest court in the land to be plausible risk of genocide. So this idea, for example, that boycotting Israel, in 2018, that felt like a very strange and fringe position amongst a lot of people who might not know the history. But now the idea of boycotting the country that has produced sort of the most harrowing, disgusting footage of war that we have ever seen feels quite sensible. So it's strange to me that the press and the political establishment still think that they can kind of draw this uninterrupted line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism or something nefarious. It's strange to me that they think that is still possible. But this question of like whether or not Israel has a right to exist, it's just such a skillfully crafted question. Because as you said, Helena, it's not a question that we apply in any other context because it doesn't make sense. As you say, people have a right to self-determination, but the form that self-determination looks like is not fixed. And it certainly does not come at the expense of the fundamental human rights of an entire group of people. But when you say, does Israel have the right to exist, the image that it deliberately conjures up in people's minds, because most people don't know, the difference between self-determination and, the legal enshrining of sovereignty and all of this. The image it conjures up is this idea of, oh, you just want to annihilate a group of people. You want to expel a particular group of people from this land. And there's this idea of, Jewish people, like they just want this one tiny piece of land. Like, why do people have such a problem with this group having this one shred of land? Given the kind of historic injustices that Jewish people have suffered, and that maybe made sense to people before they realized through the genocide that there are also a lot of people who have already lived in that land, many of whom are not Jewish, some of whom were Jewish, and therefore to implement a state that is in its charter classified as an ethno-state that privileges the rights and interests of one group of people over another requires ethnic cleansing and requires an ongoing system of apartheid. Well, suddenly that doesn't sound so kind of benign. It sounds a lot more complicated than that.
It's also worth pointing out too, like, Israel does not define its own borders, There is no proper definition of where those borders end. Is it Area C? Is it the Green Line? Is it from the river to the sea, as the Likud Party's charter states that they would like it to be, right? Like, that is specifically made to be somewhat ambiguous so they can maintain sovereignty over the West Bank without absorbing the population into their population to maintain the ethnic majority of Jews in the area, or indeed so they don't face accusations of wanting to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians, even though especially when it comes to Likud, we all know that was what they would rather do, to maintain sovereignty over the territory or keep them locked into Bantustans.
Yeah, and because the image that it conjures up is this idea of you want to force people, like an entire community of people, into exile, which particularly in Europe, there's a particular memory there of that happening to Jewish people within Europe. And that's what it evokes. But that is not what the Palestinian Liberation Movement is about. The Palestinian Liberation Movement is about saying you don't get to build an ethno-state in this land, like
in the houses that we used to live in the houses we have the keys for.
Exactly. You don't get to steal our homes, to steal our land, to destroy our agriculture, and establish an apartheid state. Basically, the historical equivalent of this is saying to anti-apartheid activists, anti-South African apartheid activists, well, do you believe in the rights of white Afrikaners to exist? And it's like,
does apartheid South Africa have a right to exist? Does Rhodesia have a right to exist?
Exactly. And it's like, well, I mean, okay, I'm not saying that everyone has to, but I'm not calling for the annihilation of an entire group of people. I'm just saying you don't get to form a racial supremacist state and be at the head of it. Exactly, and do everything that entails. And I think this idea of this language of self-determination, it's not, being able to have an ethno-state is not a right that is enshrined under the right of self-determination. But it gives it kind of glosses over what actually maintaining Israel in the way that it is imagined by people who ask that question. It is erasing the actual granular violence that it requires to maintain that. Ta-Nehisi Coates, when he talks about in his book, his most recent book, I've forgotten what it's called, but he talks about how, as a Black American, he had often cited Israel as an example of a reparative project, saying that, this is a community, Jewish people who have faced systemic racism, systemic dispossession, genocide within Europe. And, they now have a land, they now have a state that is a haven of safety. And he sort of thought of that as something that could possibly be an option for Black Americans, and there's long history of nation building as a kind of reparative project within the kind of Black American political imagination.
That's what Liberia was, right?
Yeah, Liberia. I mean, the Liberians were like, not here, honey, not here, sweetie. You're not going to be bringing that nonsense here, that Yank nonsense over here. But and it was when he actually went to the West Bank, it's when he actually went to actually look at what this looks like in practice, that he was like, oh, no. This is not a liberatory project. This is not a reparative project. This is a racial supremacist apartheid project.
Colonial project as well.
Colonial project, in order to make this vision a reality. When you spin it a certain way, it can sound cute and it can sound nice. But what the last 3 years has really brought home is what is actually required, what is the violence and the inequality and the dispossession and the theft that is required to make this a reality. And that's why I'm surprised that they think that we're still in 2018, 2019, where the public don't have a sense of that.
Well, yeah, and I think a lot of people just don't realise how Israel came into being in the first place. They don't know about the death marches from Lydda. They don't know about the expulsions. They don't know about Deir Yassin. They don't know about the reality of how Israel was formed and the reality of how it had come to be this way, because they've been living in a propaganda world before the new historians found the declassified documents. And one final point I make is that when you talk about apartheid South Africa, that's basically the model that we're looking for. You take a former apartheid state, you break down, you dissolve the previous entity, and you create a new entity in its place where people have equal rights, where it's a state where multiple ethnicities can live together without an apartheid. That seems perfectly fine to me. And you get historical examples. There have been plenty of dissolved states, and no one right now is saying, does Yugoslavia have a right to exist? They don't. It's still alive in my heart. Google Deepmind, the UK headquartered artificial intelligence branch of the internet giant, recently went back on a pledge not to develop AI for weapons use. And last week, the corporation told its unhappy staff it was proud to have signed a contract with the Pentagon, allowing its technology to be used in classified military operations. That was an extension of an existing $200 million contract, which allowed the military to use Google AI tools in some domains. Under the new terms, the military can now use Google AI for, quote, any lawful government purpose, with Google surrendering all rights to veto its use in classified operations that the military say fall under that description. Employees of the company were, unsurprisingly, not very happy about it. In an open letter to bosses, they wrote this in response to the deal. We want to see AI benefit humanity, not to see it being used in inhumane or extremely harmful ways. This includes lethal autonomous weapons and mass surveillance, but extends beyond. The only way to guarantee that Google does not become associated with such harms is to reject any classified workloads. Otherwise, such uses may occur without our knowledge or the power to stop them. The carve-out that Google employees were asking for is similar to the one that competitor AI firm Anthropic insisted on when discussing contracts with the Pentagon earlier this year. As a result of their stand, Anthropic has been shunned by the US Department of War, who have turned to other companies such as OpenAI and Google Deepmind. Now, this is not the first time Google workers have been at odds with their employer over defense contracts. In 2017, Google signed up to run for Project Methven for the Pentagon. This was an initiative to integrate AI into military functions like target selection, surveillance, and intelligence gathering. But workers protested and organized against the contract, with Google withdrawing from the deal in 2018 as a result. With Google out of the picture, tech giant Palantir swooped in to grab the contract, valued at around $160 million a year. Project Methven has recently been implicated in the US's illegal war in Iran, with questions raised about Palantir's role in producing the system, which identified a girls' school as a target. Over 150 civilians were killed in that strike, including 120 school children. So working with the Pentagon should be seen as a reputational risk for big tech. However, the incentives in the other direction are also strong. The Pentagon last month requested $54 billion to fund its Defense Autonomous Warfare Group. And with Google and the other major AI companies spending tens of billions each year on data centers, that's money that they want to get their hands on. So is there anything that could stop AI firms getting further into bed with the military-industrial complex? Well, in the UK, Google Deepmind workers are attempting to unionize, in opposition to their work being put into US military hands. After voting to unionize in April, UK workers wrote to Google bosses on Tuesday, demanding that they recognise the Communication Workers Union and unite the union as joint representatives of the around 1,000 Deepmind employees. They'll have 10 days to agree voluntarily recognition or begin negotiations, after which a legal process will begin. The CWU's National Officer for Tech Workers, John Chadfield, said this. This is a really important moment where tech workers at Google's Frontier AI lab are connecting with some of the most oppressed people in communities around the world in meaningful ways, based on foundational values of solidarity and trade unionism. By exercising their rights to collectivize, they are in a strong position to demand their employers stop circling the ethical drain of military-industrial contracts, echoing the sentiments of many working people in the UK and elsewhere. Now, for obvious reasons, Deepmind workers involved in the unionization are very cautious about talking to the press on the record. But Michael Walker has spoken with one of those involved in the action, under conditions of very strict anonymity. To that end, our editor Stephen Methven has voiced their lines in the following audio interview, in which Michael began by asking them to explain what kinds of uses they feared their work being put to.
Recently, there was this big controversy between Anthropic and the Pentagon, where they refused to allow for lawful use of surveillance and autonomous weapons with the AI, and thus surveillance of American citizens domestically as well as internationally. And this led the Pentagon to labeling them a supply chain risk and retracting from this, and a lot of backlash. Google just signed a contract with the Pentagon allowing lawful use of autonomous weapons and surveillance. So I think this is one of the most frightening things to have occurred. And given that there's no restriction in the language, you can very much imagine that this is how it might be used.
And what do you hope the unionization drive could achieve if you are successful at unionizing?
We would hope for, in the maximalist case, that we would be able to change the terms and conditions for these contracts to always rule out those types of applications, as well as providing ways to automatically monitor for these types of applications happening. Because I guess one of the problems with confidential use cases is it's deployed in a specific server that no one can have access to apart from potentially just that military organization. And at that point, you're just letting it into the wild, right? And especially if you've removed guardrails. But even if you have guardrails, guardrails could be circumvented. Jailbreaking happens all the time with large language models. So even guardrails aren't necessarily enough. A lot of us believe you need monitoring, and you need it in the contractual agreement, and you need to be able to pull that if that contractual agreement is broken.
And what's your analysis of why Google have been willing to sort of go further than Anthropic and say, yes, we are willing to sort of hand over this product for you to use for, quote unquote, any legal purposes? Presumably that comes with a big risk in terms of their reputation if they're shown to be the bad guys compared to one of their main competitors.
Yeah, it definitely does. I think things are deeper. There's deeper political ties, I think, between Google Alphabet and the US government. We know that there's been historic anti-monopoly cases against Google. And I think there's probably a real fear that if they don't collaborate as necessary, this is a card that the Trump government can play at any time. And then I think there's the personal political ties between shareholders / co-founders and the Trump government, which is publicly known.
And Google, obviously headquartered in the United States, DeepMind headquartered in the UK. Which of those workforces, I suppose, is the most significant here?
It depends what you mean by significant. But in terms of contributions to the core technologies that would be used by the Pentagon, would very much say it's America. It's where the majority of employees lie. But the UK is not an insignificant part of that picture. Given, one, the roots plus the size of the office plus the headquarters. And the other thing is that this technology isn't, you can't fragment this technology, right? You can't split up the UK model and the US model and say, we'll give them just this chunk of the model. And we'll keep this chunk for military applications and this chunk for general customers. It's all tied into the same model and used and distributed throughout all of Google.
And what impression do you get about, I suppose, as to how Google might respond to a unionization drive? I assume they're not a particularly union-friendly employer.
No, they're definitely not. There was a unionization drive in Google UK recently with a very small job family, and they responded, as is typically the case, where there was some union busting that was done. It wasn't maybe as severe as, say, TikTok's response was in London, where they fired, I think, like 400 people. But yeah, we're not necessarily expecting a nice response. But I think DeepMind is a bit different to Google. It is a part of it, but it's a separate kind of research lab and has a completely different set of leadership who are mostly scientists, have been scientists all their lives, very dedicated to the research. And so I think we really have no idea what to expect from the response.
We talked about so far the potential for military uses of Google AI, and that seems to be sort of one of the drivers of this current unionization drive. Many other issues that people discuss a lot about AI because it seems it could be transformative. So I suppose automation of jobs being one of them. I mean, to what extent are you guys worried that you're automating your own jobs and that you might have some leverage now, but soon you'll just be replaceable by the models that you yourselves have created?
Exactly. So I think there's definitely some of us, a bit of a hierarchy in terms of issues that we're trying to grasp with. And we very much care about a big swathe of issues, including climate as one of them, automation of our roles as well as other people's roles. But what feels most pressing is a kind of, the preservation of human life and human rights. And this is one of the reasons, automation is one of the reasons why it feels very timely that we need to act now, because we don't know in a few years' time we're going to even have the collective bargaining power to act. We could be automated out of our own roles by then. And at that point, there is no collective bargaining power. So whilst we still have it, we need to act.
In terms of, I suppose, protecting life, lots of very prominent people suggesting that not only could AI be used sort of by militaries for nefarious ends, but it could itself end up having fairly apocalyptic outcomes, either because we lose control of it or because of some kind of misuse. How are the workforce at Google Deepmind sort of relating to this conversation? It must be quite odd sort of going to work every day when there is quite a large group of esteemed people saying that this business could literally end human life on the earth. I mean, I don't know what you think about that. Maybe you think it's far-fetched, but how is that being talked about within DeepMind?
This is kind of the existential risk camp. There's kind of two categories of people, and I guess three when they fall in between. But there's the existential risk and the kind of accumulative incremental risk. And I'm very much in the incremental risk category. I think that if you completely ignore all societal problems, aiming for a solution for the one at the very end of the journey, then by the time you get there, there'll be no society left. And you need to solve the societal problems as they arise. And we need proof that we can solve these problems as they arrive in order to gain trust that the very same people, government, society are also going to be around to solve the even bigger problems down the line.
I mean, that suggests that you're not worried that the sort of big existential, apocalyptic scenario is going to happen in the next sort of few months or years. You think we have got some time to work that one out?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. And I don't know if that will ever happen. I think it's one of these low probability catastrophic events. You need to always prepare for catastrophic events. That's why we prepare for, hurricanes hitting various parts of the world where they've never necessarily hit before. But you still can't ignore the rest of the way the weather works. That might not be catastrophic, but could still cause damage to society.
That was an anonymous Google DeepMind worker speaking to Michael Walker earlier. Now, in response to the workers' demands, Google have said this. Google UK recently received a letter from Unite and the Communication Workers Union requesting recognition for Google DeepMind UK employees. We have always valued constructive dialogue with employees and will remain focused on creating a positive and successful workplace. Didn't seem necessarily like a call to recognise the union there, but I will wait and see. Dalia, on a broader question though, this shows that workers' collective bargaining power will always be at the forefront of the fight to ensure morality in terms of business practice, insofar as it doesn't matter what your business is, it doesn't matter what you do. If you want to put your business towards unethical ends, you have to rely on your workers' desire and their motivation to do that for you. And so any amount of collective action, as far as a union is concerned, can be put to use to stop that. Don't you agree?
Yeah, and that's one of the interesting things about tech worker organizing is because of the ways in which technology is particularly AI technology is being rolled out in a way that is, I would basically, we have developed a technology whose capacity for destruction is rivaled maybe only by the atomic bomb. It's huge. And so within that context, a tech worker union is not just about bread and butter issues. It's not wage disputes. It's not just kind of contract disputes or conditions disputes, although it does involve that, and that's obviously important. But it also is about sort of our collective kind of future, because when you have this technology that has this incredible capacity for damage, and there are no guardrails, the government, either the government regulation is unable to keep up with technological developments, or the government is complicit and an active agent in the malicious use of these technologies, or you have companies, as was mentioned in that interview, this kind of Silicon Valley philosophy of like move fast and break things. So like even if there are regulations, even if there are rules, you just break them and you deal with the consequences later, you pay the fines or whatever. And so within this system, this very fast moving development, there are very few checks and balances. And one of the only checks and balances that we still have is worker power. And I was very alarmed to hear in that interview that amongst people who are involved in making technology, because one thing that tech workers, as political agents, it's they have authority. So one of the ways in which a lot of us get bamboozled by these technological conversations is a lot of us don't really understand how it works. So when you have the people who are making these technologies saying certain things, it does carry an authority. And when they said, we need to use worker power while we still have it, because there's a good chance that a lot of us are going to be automated out of our job, or at least made de-skilled to the point where we actually can't express leverage in the way that we could at another point. That's really, really alarming, because at the moment, workers, having a political consciousness, workers being unionized is kind of one of the only points of friction in the rollout of these technologies. And it's been a long road, because I have some friends who are very effective tech worker organizers who are themselves tech workers, and they've spoken about how it's been quite difficult for a while to get tech workers to unionize, because a lot of them are quite well paid. A lot of them have, so they wouldn't think of themselves as workers that necessarily need to be unionized. And there's also a kind of culture of thinking that, as tech workers, we sort of sit outside of politics, and, we just look for efficient and effective solutions to problems. And one thing that I've been hearing from my tech worker friends is that Palestine has actually been a real turning point, where seeing the technologies that you develop being used to conduct a genocide has made a lot of tech workers realize that they are political agents, and this idea that they sit outside of politics is completely flawed, and that actually they don't want their names and their labor to be appropriated in this way. So we are seeing a kind of a movement of political consciousness amongst tech workers, and it's sad to hear that time could be running out on whether or not that's effective. But it's also worth thinking about how, though a lot of these technologies also rely on us as consumers of these technological products. In many ways, we're all tech workers, because we all generate the data that make these technologies usable. And so there's also something for us to be doing, maybe not in terms of consumer boycotts, because one thing that's so effective about a company like Google is that it embeds itself so much in our everyday life that it's almost impossible to make an individual choice to not use it. But things like campaigning to make sure that your local government does not implement some of these technologies in your local services. This is why things like getting Palantir out of the NHS, campaigns like this are really, really important. So yes, the tech workers are a really important part of this story of resistance, but there's also something for us to do here, because ultimately it's our data and it's our information that makes these technologies so powerful and so usable. And particularly when it comes to a company like Google, Google is a very powerful actor here. It's not a matter of if we don't do it, some other company will. Google is as if not more powerful than most national governments. It is the gatekeeper of information and data across the entire world. And so if something changes in Google with this one company, if guardrails are put in with Google, then that really does impact what is possible when it comes to the exploitation of these technologies for warfare, policing, surveillance, etc.
Certainly true. Certainly true. Well, thank you very much, Dalia, for joining me tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for having me. I'm going to go vote now.
Oh, good. Oh, yes, of course. Indeed. It is indeed local elections in this area of the country. Not where I'm from, unfortunately. I have not had the joy of voting today, unfortunately. I thank you, everyone at home, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for a bumper show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.